The sound that woke Samuel Hartwell that September morning would haunt him for the rest of his life. It wasn't the familiar creak of his ranch house settling in the pre-dawn cold, nor the distant lowing of his cattle stirring in the pasture. It was something else entirely, a soft, desperate whimpering coming from his barn, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. Samuel rolled from his narrow bed, his weathered hands reaching instinctively for the Colt revolver that never left his bedside. At 30 years old, he had learned that survival on the Wyoming frontier meant treating every unexpected sound as a potential threat. The Sioux raids had ended 3 years ago, but desperate men and wild animals still prowled the vast emptiness that stretched between his ranch and the nearest settlement of Copper Creek, 47 miles to the east. The wooden floorboards protested under his boots as he moved through his one-room cabin, pausing only to pull on his worn leather vest and grab his hat from the hook beside the door. The September air bit at his exposed skin, carrying with it the scent of dying grass and the promise of an early winter. Above him, stars flickered like scattered diamonds against the deep purple sky, with dawn still hours away. The barn loomed ahead, its dark silhouette stark against the starlit horizon. Samuel had built it himself 2 summers ago, cutting every board and driving every nail with his own hands. It stood solid and proud, housing his 3 horses, his milk cow, and enough hay to last through the harsh Wyoming winter that would soon grip the land in its merciless embrace. But now something was wrong. The whimpering came again, clearer this time, and Samuel felt his blood run cold. It was human, unmistakably human, and filled with a desperation that spoke of suffering beyond imagination. He approached the barn door with practiced stealth, his revolver drawn and ready, every sense heightened to razor sharpness. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, which was impossible. Samuel never left his barn unsecured, not with wolves prowling the area, and the constant threat of thieves who would steal anything of value, including the precious livestock that represented his life's work and his only hope of surviving another brutal frontier winter. He eased the door open just enough to slip inside, his eyes straining to penetrate the thick darkness that filled the barn's interior. The familiar smells enveloped him: hay, leather, horse sweat, and the earthy scent of the milk cow's stall. But underneath it all lurked something else, something that made his stomach clench with dread. The sound of his own heartbeat thundered in his ears as he stood motionless, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the deeper darkness within the barn. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the gloom, the familiar outline of his plow, the neat stacks of hay bales he had spent weeks cutting and storing, the wooden stalls that housed his animals. And there, huddled in the farthest corner where the hay was stacked highest, was a figure so small and still that he almost missed it entirely. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. A person, definitely a person, crouched among his hay bales like some wild creature seeking shelter. The figure was slight, wrapped in what appeared to be the tattered remains of a dress, long hair hanging in tangled curtains that obscured any view of the face beneath. For a moment, neither moved. Samuel stood frozen by the door, his weapon trained on the intruder, while the mysterious figure remained curled in the hay like a wounded animal. Then, slowly, the person raised their head, and Samuel found himself looking into the most extraordinary pair of eyes he had ever seen. They were green, not the pale green of new grass, but the deep, intense green of pine needles in shadow. And they were filled with such raw, unguarded fear that Samuel felt his own fear transform instantly into something else entirely, a protective instinct so powerful it nearly drove him to his knees. The eyes belonged to a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with a face that would have been beautiful if not for the gaunt hollows of starvation and the purple-black bruises that decorated her cheekbones like grotesque war paint. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin pale as winter moonlight, and her hair, once probably golden, now hung in dirty, matted strands around her shoulders. But it was what she was doing that stopped Samuel's heart entirely. She was eating his hay, not just nibbling at it out of curiosity or desperation, but consuming it with the focused intensity of someone who had not eaten in days. Her small hands clutched fistfuls of the dried grass, shoving it into her mouth with mechanical determination, her jaw working steadily as she chewed and swallowed the coarse fodder meant for his livestock. Samuel lowered his weapon, his mind reeling. In 10 years of frontier life, he had seen many desperate things. Men driven to eat their own horses during the harsh winter of 1872, Women who had walked barefoot through snow to reach safety. Children who had survived on nothing but melted snow and tree bark. But this was something beyond desperation. This was a human being reduced to the level of a grazing animal, so far past hunger that she had lost the ability to distinguish between food fit for people and food meant for beasts. The woman's eyes never left his face as she continued eating, her expression a mixture of defiance and resignation that spoke of someone who had been pushed past the breaking point but refused to surrender entirely. She expected him to drive her away, perhaps even to shoot her where she crouched. But she would not stop eating until he forced her to stop. Samuel felt something crack open inside his chest, a wall he had built around his heart during his years of solitary existence on the frontier. He had chosen this life deliberately, fleeing the crowded cities of the East, where too many people meant too many complications. Out here, a man could live by his own rules, answerable to no one but himself and the harsh demands of survival. But looking at this broken young woman, he realized that some things transcended personal choice. Very slowly, Samuel holstered his revolver and raised both hands, palms forward, in the universal gesture of peace. The woman's chewing slowed but did not stop, her green eyes tracking his every movement with the hypervigilance of prey that had learned to expect attack from every direction. He spoke softly, keeping his voice low and gentle. "It's all right. You don't have to be afraid." The woman's only response was to clutch another handful of hay more tightly, as if she feared he would try to take even this meager sustenance away from her. Samuel's heart clenched as he realized that she probably could not even understand his words through the fog of starvation and exhaustion that clearly gripped her mind. He tried again, even more gently. "When did you last eat real food?" This time something flickered in her eyes, a spark of comprehension that suggested she understood him, even if she could not or would not respond. She swallowed the hay in her mouth and watched him warily, her breathing quick and shallow. Samuel took a careful step closer, moving with the same patience he used when approaching a spooked horse. The woman tensed but did not flee, which he took as progress. Another step brought him close enough to see the full extent of her condition, and what he saw made his stomach turn. She was not just thin, she was skeletal. Her dress, which had once been blue calico, hung on her frame like fabric draped over a scarecrow. Her wrists were so narrow that Samuel was certain he could encircle them with his thumb and forefinger. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her skin had the greyish pallor of someone whose body was consuming itself to stay alive. But it was the marks on her arms and throat that made Samuel's jaw clench with rage. Bruises in the distinctive pattern of fingerprints, old enough to have faded to yellow and green, told a story of violence that made him want to hunt down whoever had done this and make them pay with their blood. The woman must have seen something of his thoughts in his expression, because she shrank back against the hay bales, her eyes wide with renewed fear. Samuel forced himself to relax, to project calm despite the fury that burned in his chest. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "My name is Samuel. This is my ranch." She stared at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded, the first real communication she had offered. Samuel felt a surge of hope that perhaps he could reach her after all. "Are you hurt? Besides," he gestured vaguely at her obvious condition, not wanting to enumerate the catalogue of abuse written across her body. The woman opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper, hoarse and broken. Cold. Such a simple word, but it contained volumes of meaning. Samuel understood immediately that she was not just talking about the September night air, though the temperature had indeed dropped since sunset. She was talking about a coldness that went bone deep, the kind of cold that came from having nowhere to go, no one to turn to, no hope of warmth or safety or comfort. Samuel made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Come inside. Let me get you some real food and a warm place to sleep." The woman's eyes widened with disbelief, as if the offer of basic human kindness was so foreign to her experience that she could not process it. She shook her head slightly, a gesture that seemed automatic rather than considered. "It's all right," Samuel said again. "I'm not asking for anything in return. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." This time, the woman's reaction was immediate and visceral. She shrank back even further, pressing herself against the hay bales as if she could disappear into them entirely. Samuel realized with a sick feeling that his offer of shelter had triggered some memory that terrified her, that someone, somewhere, had offered her help before, and extracted a price she was not willing to pay again. He changed tactics, settling himself cross-legged on the barn floor a respectful distance away. If she would not come inside, he would at least make sure she understood that she was not alone. "You don't have to come inside if you don't want to," he said calmly. "But you can't keep eating hay. It'll tear up your stomach something fierce." The woman looked down at the dried grass still clutched in her hands, then back at Samuel. For the first time, he saw a flicker of something that might have been embarrassment cross her features. "I'll bring you some real food out here if you'd prefer. Bread, maybe some soup, something that won't hurt you." She watched him carefully, clearly trying to determine if this was some kind of trick. Samuel waited patiently, letting her make the decision in her own time. He had gentled enough wild horses to know that trust could not be rushed. Finally, she gave the smallest of nods. Samuel smiled, the first genuine smile he had managed in months. "All right then, I'll be right back, don't go anywhere." As he rose and walked back toward his cabin, Samuel's mind was already racing ahead, planning what he could prepare that would be gentle enough for someone in her condition. Broth, certainly. Maybe some soft bread soaked in milk. Something that would provide nourishment without overwhelming a stomach that had been empty for too long. Behind him, he heard the soft rustle of hay as the woman settled back against the bales. When he glanced over his shoulder, she was still watching him, but the naked terror in her eyes had softened slightly. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the first step toward trust, and that was enough for now. Samuel built up his fire and set a pot of water to boil, his movements quick and efficient despite the early hour. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the woman in his barn, about how she had come to be there, what had driven her to such desperate circumstances, and what he was going to do about it. One thing was certain, he could not simply feed her and send her on her way. Whatever had happened to her, wherever she had come from, she was in no condition to survive on her own. The frontier was unforgiving to strong, healthy people. It would kill someone in her condition within days. As the water began to steam, Samuel realized that his quiet, solitary life was about to become considerably more complicated. But as he thought of those haunting green eyes and the way she had clutched that hay as if it were the most precious thing in the world, he found that he did not mind the complication as much as he should have. Some things, he reflected, were worth the trouble. The water reached a rolling boil, and Samuel began to prepare the first real meal the mysterious woman would have eaten in what was clearly far too long. Outside, dawn was still hours away, but already this day felt different from any other in his 30 years of life. He crumbled stale bread into the hot water, adding a precious pinch of salt and a small piece of bacon fat that he had been saving for Sunday breakfast. The aroma that rose from the pot was simple but nourishing, the kind of basic sustenance that could bring someone back from the edge of starvation without shocking their system. As he stirred the makeshift porridge, Samuel found his thoughts drifting to the woman's condition. The bruises on her arms and throat told a story he had seen too often on the frontier. Women fleeing violent husbands, daughters escaping brutal fathers, or worse, victims of the predators who stalked the empty spaces between settlements. But there was something different about this woman, something in her eyes that suggested her story was more complex than simple domestic violence. The way she had eaten that hay spoke of desperation beyond anything Samuel had witnessed. He had seen starving people before, had shared his last meal with travelers who had not eaten in days, but none of them had ever been reduced to consuming animal fodder with such mechanical determination. This woman had crossed a line that separated the desperately hungry from the truly broken. Samuel ladled the warm porridge into his best bowl, a piece of actual china that his sister had sent him from Boston 3 years ago, one of the few reminders he kept of the civilized world he had left behind. He wrapped a clean towel around the bowl to keep it warm and selected a spoon from his small collection of utensils. The walk back to the barn felt longer than it should have, his boots crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. The temperature had dropped another few degrees since he had gone inside, and Samuel found himself hoping the woman had enough sense to burrow deeper into the hay for warmth. Exposure could kill her as surely as starvation, and in her weakened condition, she would have little resistance to the cold. When he pushed open the barn door, he half expected to find the space empty, convinced that the entire encounter had been some kind of exhaustion-induced hallucination. But she was still there, exactly where he had left her, curled among the hay bales like a wounded animal that had found a temporary den. She looked up at his approach, her green eyes reflecting the faint starlight that filtered through the gaps in the barn walls. Samuel was struck again by how young she was, 20 at most, with delicate features that spoke of genteel upbringing despite her current condition. This was not some hardened frontier woman who had grown up expecting privation and violence. This was someone who had known comfort once, which made her current state all the more heartbreaking. "I brought you something to eat," Samuel said quietly, settling himself on the ground a few feet away from her. He set the bowl between them, close enough for her to reach, but far enough away that she would not feel trapped or threatened by his presence. The woman stared at the bowl as if she could not quite believe it was real. Steam rose from the warm porridge, carrying with it the savory scent of bacon fat and bread. Samuel watched as her nostrils flared slightly, her body responding to the smell of real food even as her mind seemed unable to process the reality of it. "Go on," he encouraged gently. "It's for you." Very slowly, the woman reached out and picked up the spoon. Her hands shook so badly that Samuel was afraid she would drop it, but she managed to maintain her grip and dip it into the porridge. The first spoonful went into her mouth with such careful deliberation that Samuel realized she was fighting every instinct that told her to devour the food as quickly as possible. She had learned somewhere in her recent past that eating too quickly after prolonged starvation could be dangerous. Someone had taught her to pace herself, which suggested that this was not her first experience with severe hunger. The thought made Samuel's chest tighten with sympathy and rage in equal measure. "Take your time," he said softly. "There's no rush." The woman ate slowly and methodically, each spoonful followed by a pause as she waited to see how her stomach would react. Samuel sat patiently, content to watch her eat and grateful that she was accepting his help, even if she still seemed ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. As she ate, some of the desperate tension began to leave her shoulders. The rigid set of her spine relaxed slightly, and the wild look in her eyes softened to something approaching normal wariness. Samuel found himself studying her face, trying to piece together clues about her identity and origins. Her bone structure was fine and delicate, with high cheekbones and a straight nose that suggested good breeding. Her hands, despite their current condition, showed no signs of the calluses and scars that marked women who had spent their lives in manual labor. This was someone who had been raised with expectations of comfort and security, someone who had never imagined she might one day be reduced to eating hay in a stranger's barn. "What's your name?" Samuel asked when she had finished about half the porridge. The woman looked up from the bowl, considering his question with obvious caution. For a moment, Samuel thought she would not answer at all. Then, in that same barely audible whisper, she spoke. "Emma." Such a simple name, but hearing it seemed to make her more real somehow, less like a figment of his imagination and more like an actual person with a history and a story. Samuel nodded respectfully. "Emma? That's a pretty name. Where are you from, Emma?" This time the wariness returned full force. Emma set down her spoon and pulled her tattered dress more tightly around herself, as if the simple question had reminded her of dangers that eating had temporarily allowed her to forget. "Far," she said finally, which was clearly all the information she was willing to share. Samuel did not push. Whatever Emma was running from, wherever she had come from, she would tell him when and if she chose to. For now it was enough that she was eating, and seemed to be accepting his help. "Well, you're safe here," he said simply. "Nobody's going to hurt you on my land." Emma studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his words were genuine or merely another trap disguised as kindness. Samuel met her gaze steadily, letting her see whatever she needed to see to convince herself of his sincerity. Finally, she picked up the spoon again and resumed eating. Samuel took this as a tentative acceptance of his promise, though he suspected it would take much more than words to truly convince her that she was safe. "How long since you ate?" he asked, after she had taken a few more spoonfuls. Emma's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She seemed to be calculating, counting back through days that had probably blurred together in a haze of hunger and desperation. 5 days, she whispered. Maybe 6. Samuel felt his jaw clench. 5 or 6 days without food would bring anyone to the edge of starvation, but for someone of Emma's slight build, it could easily have been fatal. The fact that she had survived long enough to reach his barn was nothing short of miraculous. Before that, Emma shook her head, either unable or unwilling to remember how long her ordeal had lasted. Samuel decided not to pursue the question further. The important thing was that she was here now, eating real food and beginning to recover from whatever hell she had escaped. "Finish up," he said gently. "You need to get some rest." Emma looked down at the bowl, which was now nearly empty. She had eaten more than half of the porridge, which was probably more food than her stomach had seen in a week. Samuel was pleased to see that she seemed to be tolerating it well, with no signs of the nausea or cramping that sometimes accompanied refeeding after prolonged starvation. "Thank you," Emma said quietly, setting the empty bowl aside. The words seemed to cost her effort, as if expressing gratitude was something she had not done in a long time. "You're welcome," Samuel replied. "Now, I know you don't want to come inside, but you can't sleep out here without proper covering. The temperature's dropping, and in your condition the cold could be dangerous." Emma's eyes flickered with the familiar wariness, but she did not immediately refuse his concern. Samuel pressed on. "I've got some extra blankets I can bring out, good wool ones that'll keep you warm, and maybe a pillow." "Why?" Emma asked suddenly, the question seeming to surprise her as much as it surprised Samuel. "Why what? Why are you helping me? You don't know me. I could be dangerous." Samuel looked at this woman who was so frail, a strong wind might blow her away, who had been reduced to eating livestock feed to survive, and felt something that might have been amusement if the situation had not been so heartbreaking. "Emma, I've dealt with dangerous people before. You're not dangerous. You're hurt and scared and half-starved, but you're not dangerous." Emma stared at him for a long moment, and Samuel had the impression that she was seeing him clearly for the first time since he had found her. Whatever she saw seemed to reassure her, because some of the tension left her posture. "I don't have any money," she said quietly. "I can't pay you. I'm not asking for payment. Everyone asks for payment eventually." The bitterness in her voice told Samuel more about Emma's recent experiences than any detailed confession could have. Someone had taught her that kindness always came with a price, that help was never freely given without expectation of something in return. Samuel felt another surge of rage toward whoever had damaged this young woman's faith in basic human decency. "Not everyone," he said simply. "Some people help because it's the right thing to do." Emma looked skeptical, but she did not argue. Samuel took this as progress. "I'll get those blankets," he said, rising to his feet. "Try to get some rest. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." As he walked back toward his cabin, Samuel found himself wondering what exactly would come next. He could not simply keep Emma in his barn indefinitely, living on charity and sleeping in the hay, but he also could not send her away, not in her current condition and certainly not without knowing what she was running from. The responsible thing would be to take her into Copper Creek, let the authorities deal with her situation. But Samuel had a deep distrust of authorities, born from too many years of watching corrupt sheriffs and incompetent judges fail the people they were supposed to protect. Emma was clearly running from something, and involving the law might very well deliver her right back into the hands of whatever she had escaped. Samuel gathered his warmest blankets and an extra pillow, then made a second trip to collect his winter coat, which he had not yet needed, but which would provide Emma with additional protection against the cold. When he returned to the barn, he found her exactly where he had left her, curled among the hay bales with her arms wrapped around her knees. "Here," he said, spreading the blankets over and around her until she was thoroughly cocooned in wool and warmth. "Better?" Emma nodded, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The transformation was remarkable. Wrapped in clean wool and with some food in her belly, she looked less like a wild creature and more like the young woman she actually was. "Samuel?" she said quietly as he prepared to leave. "Yes? Thank you. For everything." Samuel touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then walked back to his cabin. But sleep did not come easily that night. Instead, he lay awake listening to the wind outside and thinking about the mysterious woman who had appeared in his barn like some kind of frontier ghost. He had no idea that Emma was lying awake as well, staring up at the barn rafters and trying to decide whether she dared trust the kindness of this strange gentleman, or that somewhere far to the east, another woman was beginning a desperate journey that would change all their lives forever. Samuel woke before dawn on the second day, his internal clock disrupted by thoughts of the woman sleeping in his barn. He dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, his movements automatic after years of frontier routine, but his mind was entirely focused on Emma and what the new day might bring. The September air had grown colder overnight, with frost painting delicate patterns on his cabin windows. Samuel built up his fire and set coffee to brew, then prepared another bowl of the simple porridge that had served Emma so well the night before. This time, he added a small piece of dried apple that he had been saving, hoping the sweetness would help her regain some strength. When he stepped outside, the world was painted in shades of silver and grey, with dawn still an hour away. The silence was complete, except for the soft whisper of wind through the grass and the distant sound of his horses moving restlessly in the pasture. Samuel walked to the barn with careful steps, not wanting to startle Emma if she was still sleeping. He found her exactly where he had left her, buried under the wool blankets with only the top of her head visible. But as he approached, he saw her eyes open immediately, alert and wary despite the early hour. Samuel realized that Emma had probably not slept deeply, if at all. When survival was at stake, the luxury of restful sleep became another casualty of desperation. "Good morning," he said softly, settling the warm bowl on a clean wooden crate near her makeshift bed. "How are you feeling?" Emma pushed herself up to a sitting position, the blankets pooling around her waist. In the dim light, Samuel could see that some color had returned to her cheeks overnight, and her eyes seemed clearer than they had the night before. The food and warmth had already begun their healing work. "Better," she said, and her voice was stronger too, less like the whisper of a ghost, and more like the words of a living woman. "Thank you. Are you warm enough?" Emma nodded, then looked toward the bowl with obvious hunger. Samuel was encouraged to see her appetite returning. It meant her body was beginning to trust that food would continue to be available, that she no longer needed to hoard every calorie against future starvation. "Eat up," he said. "I added some apple this time. Figured you might like a little sweetness." Emma's eyes widened slightly at this small luxury. She reached for the spoon with hands that shook much less than they had the night before, then took her first bite. Samuel watched as her expression softened with something that might have been pleasure, the first positive emotion he had seen from her since finding her in his barn. "It's good," she said quietly, and Samuel felt a surge of satisfaction at her words. As Emma ate, Samuel found himself studying her more carefully in the growing light. With proper food in her stomach and warm blankets around her shoulders, she looked less like a wild creature and more like the young woman she actually was. Her hair, though still tangled and dirty, showed hints of the golden color it had once been. Her skin, while still pale and marked with bruises, had lost some of its grayish pallor. But it was her hands that told the most complete story. As she held the spoon, Samuel could see that her fingers were long and elegant, with the calluses of someone who had once played piano or done fine needlework. These were not the hands of a woman who had grown up in poverty or hardship. Emma had known comfort once, which made her current condition all the more tragic. "Emma," Samuel said carefully, not wanting to push too hard, but needing to understand her situation, "is there anyone looking for you? Anyone who might be worried?" Emma's spoon paused halfway to her mouth, and Samuel saw the familiar wariness return to her eyes. She set the spoon down and pulled the blankets more tightly around herself, as if physical barriers could protect her from unwanted questions. "No," she said finally. "No one's looking for me." Samuel sensed there was more to the story, but he did not press. Instead, he changed the subject to something less threatening. "Well, you can't stay in the barn indefinitely. It's going to get colder, and you need proper shelter. I've been thinking maybe we could fix up the old line shack on the north section of my property. It's not much, but it's got 4 walls and a roof, and with some work, we could make it comfortable." Emma stared at him with obvious disbelief. "You would do that for me? Why not? I could use some help around the ranch anyway. Someone to tend the chickens, maybe help with the garden next spring. Could be an arrangement that works for both of us." The offer was more generous than Samuel had originally intended, but as the words left his mouth, he realized he meant every one of them. The truth was, he had grown tired of his solitary existence, and there was something about Emma that made him want to protect her, to give her a chance to rebuild whatever life she had lost. Emma finished her porridge in silence, clearly thinking hard about his proposition. Samuel waited patiently, letting her work through whatever internal calculations were necessary for someone who had learned not to trust easy offers of help. "What would you want in return?" she asked finally, and Samuel heard the echo of old pain in her voice. "Nothing more than I said. Help with the ranch work, someone to talk to in the evenings, that's all." "That's all?" The disbelief in her voice made Samuel's chest tighten with sympathy. Someone had taught Emma that kindness always came with hidden costs, that generosity was merely a disguise for exploitation. Samuel wondered what she had endured to learn such bitter lessons at such a young age. "That's all," he said firmly. "You have my word." Emma searched his face for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth of his intentions in his expression. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her, because some of the tension left her shoulders. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll help with the ranch work." Samuel felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "Good. Then let's start by getting you properly cleaned up and into some decent clothes. I think I've got some things that might fit you, at least temporarily." The second day passed in a blur of practical activity. Samuel helped Emma to the cabin, where she washed with warm water and soap for the first time in weeks. He provided her with one of his smaller shirts and a pair of trousers that, while far too large, could be cinched with a belt and rolled up at the cuffs. Clean clothes and a thorough washing transformed Emma's appearance dramatically, revealing the true extent of her youth and beauty beneath the grime and desperation that had masked it. While Emma rested, Samuel rode out to inspect the old line shack he had mentioned. It was in better condition than he had remembered. Solid walls, a good roof, and a stone fireplace that would provide adequate heat. With some cleaning and a few basic repairs, it could indeed serve as comfortable temporary housing. That evening, Samuel prepared a more substantial meal, beans and bacon with fresh bread, and was pleased to see Emma eat with obvious enjoyment. Her appetite was returning quickly, and she seemed more alert and engaged than she had since he found her. "Tell me about your ranch," Emma said as they sat by the fire after dinner. It was the first time she had initiated conversation, and Samuel took it as a sign that she was beginning to trust him. Samuel told her about his cattle, his plans for expanding the herd, the challenges of frontier life and the simple satisfactions of building something with your own hands. Emma listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that showed she understood more about ranching than he would have expected from someone of her obviously refined background. "You know about livestock," Samuel observed. Emma hesitated, then nodded slowly. "My father had property before—" She did not finish the sentence, but Samuel understood. Emma had indeed grown up with privilege, on some estate or large farm where she had learned about animals and agriculture. Something had happened to change her circumstances dramatically, something she was still not ready to discuss. "Well, that'll make things easier," Samuel said simply, not pushing for details she was not ready to share. The third day dawned clear and cold, with the promise of winter written in the sharp edge of the wind. Samuel woke with a strange sense of anticipation, as if something significant was about to happen, though he could not have said what or why. He had learned to trust such instincts during his years on the frontier, where survival often depended on reading subtle signs that others might miss. Emma was already awake when he reached the barn, sitting up among her blankets and looking stronger than she had since her arrival. The hollow look had left her cheeks, and her eyes held more life than Samuel had yet seen. 3 days of regular food and safety had worked remarkable changes in her condition. "I want to help today," she said as soon as she saw him. "With the ranch work. You said you needed help, and I want to earn my keep." Samuel was pleased by her determination, though he worried that she might be pushing herself too hard too soon. Still, he recognized the importance of useful work in rebuilding someone's sense of self-worth and dignity. "All right," he agreed. "We'll start easy. Maybe you can help me check on the cattle, see how they're doing before winter sets in." They spent the morning riding out to the pastures. Emma mounted on Samuel's gentlest mare and wearing his spare coat against the cold. She proved to be an excellent rider, sitting her horse with the natural grace of someone who had learned young and well. Samuel found himself enjoying her company more than he had enjoyed anyone's in years. Emma seemed to blossom in the open air and sunshine, her face losing some of its guarded wariness as she focused on the work at hand. She had an excellent eye for cattle, quickly spotting animals that might need attention and asking intelligent questions about herd management and winter preparation. It was almost noon when they saw the rider approaching from the east, a distant figure wavering in the heat shimmer that rose from the sun-warmed earth. Samuel reined in his horse and shaded his eyes with his hand, trying to make out details of the stranger. Emma had spotted the rider too, and Samuel was alarmed to see all the color drain from her face. She sat frozen in her saddle, staring at the approaching figure with an expression of absolute terror. "Emma? What is it?" But Emma seemed unable to speak. She sat rigid on her horse, her breathing quick and shallow, her hands clutching the reins so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Samuel had seen this reaction before, in soldiers who had survived terrible battles and refugees who had fled unspeakable violence. Emma was having some kind of panic response to the sight of the approaching stranger. "Emma," Samuel said more urgently, moving his horse closer to hers. "Talk to me, who is that?" Emma's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "She found me. Oh God, she found me." The rider was close enough now for Samuel to make out more details. It was indeed a woman, middle-aged and well-dressed, mounted on a fine bay horse that spoke of wealth and quality. She rode with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in control, her back straight and her bearing imperious. But it was Emma's reaction that held Samuel's attention. The young woman was shaking now, her entire body trembling as if she had been struck with sudden fever. Whatever history existed between Emma and this approaching rider, it was not a pleasant one. "Emma," Samuel said firmly, reaching out to touch her arm. "Look at me, look at me." Emma's green eyes snapped to his face, wide with panic. "You're safe," Samuel said quietly. "Whatever happened before, you're safe now. I promised you that, remember?" Emma nodded jerkily, but Samuel could see that his words were doing little to calm her terror. The approaching rider had awakened some nightmare that Emma had been trying to escape, and now that nightmare was bearing down on them across the Wyoming prairie. The woman pulled her horse to a stop about 20 feet away, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. She was perhaps 45 years old, with steel-grey hair pinned in a severe bun and a face that might once have been beautiful, but was now marked by years of bitterness and disappointment. Her traveling dress was expensive but practical, and she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to having her orders obeyed without question. But it was her eyes that made Samuel's skin crawl. They were cold and calculating, devoid of warmth or compassion, and when they fixed on Emma, they held a possessive hunger that made Samuel think of a snake eyeing a trapped mouse. "Emma, darling," the woman said, and her voice was cultured and refined, with just a hint of some Eastern accent. "You've led me on quite a chase." Emma seemed to shrink in on herself at the sound of that voice. She had not spoken since identifying the rider, and Samuel could see that she was fighting just to remain conscious. Whatever this woman represented to Emma, it was something that touched the very core of her terror. "Who are you?" Samuel asked, moving his horse slightly forward so that he was positioned between Emma and the stranger. The woman's cold gaze shifted to Samuel, and he felt as if he were being evaluated by a predator, deciding whether he represented a threat or merely an inconvenience. "I am Mrs. Margaret Whitmore," she said with obvious expectation that the name should mean something to him. When Samuel showed no recognition, her lips tightened with displeasure. "Emma is my daughter. She has been unwell and ran away from home. I have come to take her back where she belongs." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. This woman claimed to be Emma's mother, but there was no warmth in her voice, no relief at finding a missing child safe. Instead, there was only cold satisfaction, as if Emma were a piece of valuable property that had been temporarily mislaid. "Emma," Samuel said quietly, not taking his eyes off Mrs. Whitmore. "Is this your mother?" Emma's response was barely audible, but Samuel caught the single word that escaped her lips. "Yes." The simple admission hit Samuel like a physical blow. This cold, calculating woman was Emma's mother, the person who should have protected her, cherished her, ensured her safety and happiness. Instead, Samuel could see in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes the same possessive hunger that he had witnessed in men who viewed women as property to be owned and controlled. "Emma has been staying on my ranch," Samuel said carefully, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the rage that was building in his chest. "She was in bad shape when I found her, starving and injured." Mrs. Whitmore's expression did not change, showing no concern for her daughter's suffering. "Emma has always been dramatic. She tends to exaggerate her difficulties for effect. Now, Emma, gather your things. We are leaving immediately." Emma's reaction was immediate and visceral. She made a small choked sound and swayed in her saddle as if she might faint. Samuel reached out quickly to steady her, his hand closing over hers on the reins. "She's not going anywhere," Samuel said quietly, and something in his voice made Mrs. Whitmore's eyes narrow with sudden attention. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me. Emma's not going with you. She's safe here, and she's going to stay that way." Mrs. Whitmore's laugh was like ice breaking. "My dear man, I fear you do not understand the situation. Emma is my daughter, and she is not yet of age. The law gives me complete authority over her welfare, and I have come to reclaim what is mine." Samuel felt his blood run cold. If Emma was not yet 21, then legally she was indeed under her mother's control, regardless of what kind of monster Mrs. Whitmore might be. The law would support a mother's right to reclaim her daughter, no matter what that daughter might have suffered at her hands. But as Samuel looked at Emma, at her terror, her desperation, the way she seemed to be literally shrinking away from her mother's presence, he made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "Then I guess we'll have to change that," he said quietly. Mrs. Whitmore raised one perfectly plucked eyebrow. "And how exactly do you propose to do that?" Samuel turned to Emma, his voice gentle despite the fury that burned in his chest. "Emma, look at me." Emma raised her eyes to his face, and Samuel saw in them a desperate hope mixed with absolute terror. "Do you trust me?" Emma's nod was barely perceptible, but it was enough. Samuel turned back to Mrs. Whitmore, his jaw set with grim determination. "Emma won't be going with you because she'll be staying here as my wife." The words seemed to hang in the air like a thunderclap. Mrs. Whitmore's face went white with shock and rage, while Emma stared at Samuel as if he had just announced his intention to sprout wings and fly. "That's impossible," Mrs. Whitmore snapped. "Emma cannot marry without my consent, and I will never give it." Samuel smiled grimly. "Actually, Ma'am, you're wrong about that. In the territory of Wyoming, a woman can marry at 18 without parental consent. And Emma here looks to be at least that old." It was a bluff. Samuel had no idea what Emma's exact age was, and territorial marriage laws were complex and often poorly enforced. But he was counting on Mrs. Whitmore not knowing the specifics either, and on Emma's mature appearance to support his claim. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes flashed with fury. "This is preposterous. Emma, tell this man that you will not marry him. Tell him that you are coming home with me immediately." Emma looked from Samuel to her mother and back again, her face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Samuel could see her weighing her options, trying to decide which choice offered her the better chance of survival. Then, in a voice that was stronger than Samuel had yet heard from her, Emma spoke. "I'll marry him." The silence that followed Emma's declaration stretched like a taut wire between them. Mrs. Whitmore's face had gone from white to red to purple, a rainbow of rage that would have been almost comical if the situation had not been so deadly serious. Samuel could practically see her calculating, trying to find some legal or social weapon that would allow her to regain control of the situation. "This is absurd," Mrs. Whitmore finally snapped. "Emma, you have known this man for 3 days. You cannot possibly be serious about marrying him." Emma's chin lifted slightly, and Samuel saw a spark of defiance that reminded him that beneath her terror and desperation lay the spirit of a survivor. "I am serious," Emma said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Samuel has shown me more kindness in 3 days than I have known in months. If he will have me, I will marry him." Samuel felt something shift in his chest at her words. What had begun as a desperate gambit to protect Emma from her mother was becoming something more real, more significant. He looked at Emma, really looked at her, and saw not just a woman he was trying to save, but a woman he was beginning to care for in ways that surprised and unsettled him. "The nearest preacher is in Copper Creek," Samuel said, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. "We could be there and back before nightfall." Mrs. Whitmore's laugh was sharp and bitter. "So you think a hasty marriage will solve anything? Emma is damaged goods, Mr. Hartwell, Samuel Hartwell. Mr. Hartwell, Emma is damaged goods. She has been compromised. No decent man would want her once he knew the truth of what she has endured." Samuel felt rage surge through him at the casual cruelty of Mrs. Whitmore's words. To speak so callously about her own daughter, to use Emma's suffering as a weapon against her, was beyond his comprehension. "Ma'am," Samuel said quietly, his voice deadly calm, "I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." Something in his tone must have penetrated Mrs. Whitmore's fury, because she took a small step back. For the first time since her arrival, she seemed to recognize that Samuel might represent a genuine threat to her plans. "You do not understand what you are involving yourself in," she said, her voice taking on a different quality, less commanding, more calculating. "Emma is not some innocent frontier girl looking for a husband. She is a ruined woman who has brought scandal and shame upon my family name. I have spent considerable time and money trying to repair the damage she has caused." Emma flinched as if she had been physically struck, and Samuel saw tears begin to track down her cheeks. Whatever Mrs. Whitmore was referring to, it was clearly a source of deep pain and shame for Emma. "I don't care," Samuel said simply. "Whatever happened to Emma before she came here, it doesn't matter to me. What matters is that she's safe and that she stays that way." Mrs. Whitmore studied Samuel with new attention, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Her expression shifted subtly, becoming more thoughtful and infinitely more dangerous. "Perhaps we can reach an arrangement," she said slowly. "You seem to be a man of property, Mr. Hartwell, a successful rancher. Surely you can appreciate the value of a business transaction." "What kind of transaction?" Mrs. Whitmore smiled, and the expression made Samuel's skin crawl. "I will give you my blessing for this marriage, along with a substantial dowry, say $5,000, if you agree to certain conditions regarding Emma's future." Samuel felt his blood turn to ice. This woman was willing to sell her own daughter, to negotiate the terms of Emma's life, as if she were a piece of livestock being traded at market. "What conditions?" Mrs. Whitmore's smile widened, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "Nothing unreasonable. Simply that Emma never be allowed to return east, never be permitted to contact her former acquaintances, and never be told certain information about her past that might disturb her newfound happiness." Samuel looked at Emma and saw that she had gone pale again, her hands shaking as she clutched her horse's reins. Whatever secrets Mrs. Whitmore was threatening to keep hidden, Emma knew what they were, and they terrified her. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" Mrs. Whitmore's expression hardened. "Then I will contest this marriage through every legal channel available. I will hire lawyers who will drag Emma's name through every court in the territory. I will ensure that every detail of her past becomes public knowledge, that every newspaper from here to New York knows exactly what kind of woman you have chosen to marry. By the time I am finished, Emma will be unmarriageable to any decent man, and you will be known as the fool who tied himself to a fallen woman." The threat hung in the air like poison. Samuel could see that Mrs. Whitmore was entirely serious, entirely capable of carrying out her promises of destruction. She had the money and connections to make Emma's life a living hell, to destroy any chance of happiness or peace that Emma might find. But as Samuel looked at Emma, at her terror, her desperation, the way she seemed to be bracing herself for yet another betrayal by someone who claimed to love her, he realized that there was really only one choice to make. "Mrs. Whitmore," Samuel said quietly, "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." The older woman leaned forward slightly, clearly expecting him to accept her offer. "You can take your money, your threats, and your legal challenges, and you can ride straight to hell with all of them." Mrs. Whitmore's face went white with shock. "I beg your pardon. Emma is going to be my wife, and she's going to be happy, and she's going to be safe. And if you or anyone else tries to hurt her or threaten her, or make her feel ashamed of whatever she survived, you'll answer to me personally." Samuel's hand moved casually to rest on the butt of his revolver, a gesture that was not lost on Mrs. Whitmore. "You're making a terrible mistake, Mr. Hartwell. Emma is not what she appears to be. She is not some innocent victim worthy of your protection." "Then tell me," Samuel said simply. "Tell me what Emma has done that's so terrible. Tell me what she's survived that makes her unworthy of kindness or love, or basic human decency." Mrs. Whitmore's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Samuel realized that whatever Emma's past might hold, Mrs. Whitmore could not or would not speak it aloud in Emma's presence. "I thought so," Samuel said grimly. "Whatever happened to Emma, it wasn't her fault, was it? She was the victim, not the perpetrator, and now you want to punish her for being victimized." Mrs. Whitmore's composure finally cracked completely. "She seduced a married man. She destroyed a respectable family. She brought scandal and ruin upon everyone who tried to help her." The words exploded from Mrs. Whitmore like a dam bursting, and Samuel saw Emma recoil as if she had been slapped. But he also saw something else in Emma's reaction, not guilt or shame, but the response of someone who had been blamed for something that was not her fault. "How old was she?" Samuel asked quietly. Mrs. Whitmore's mouth snapped shut. "How old was Emma when this happened?" "That is not relevant. How old?" Mrs. Whitmore's silence was answer enough. Samuel felt sick as he realized what Emma's story must be. A young girl, probably 15 or 16, manipulated or forced by an older man, then blamed for her own victimization when the situation became public knowledge. "Get off my land," Samuel said quietly. Mrs. Whitmore straightened in her saddle, trying to regain some of her earlier authority. "This is not over, Mr. Hartwell. I will not allow—" "Get off my land," Samuel repeated, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made Mrs. Whitmore's horse sidestep nervously. "Now!" Mrs. Whitmore looked from Samuel to Emma and back again, clearly calculating her options. What she saw in Samuel's expression must have convinced her that further argument would be both futile and dangerous, because she gathered her reins with sharp, angry movements. "You will regret this decision," she said coldly. "Both of you will regret this." With that final threat, Mrs. Whitmore wheeled her horse around and spurred it into a gallop, disappearing across the prairie in a cloud of dust and fury. Samuel watched until she was completely out of sight, then turned his attention to Emma. Emma was crying, not the desperate sobs of hysteria, but the quiet tears of someone who had been carrying an unbearable weight and suddenly found it lifted from her shoulders. She sat slumped in her saddle, her entire body shaking with relief and exhaustion. "Emma," Samuel said gently, moving his horse closer to hers. "Are you all right?" Emma looked up at him with eyes that were bright with tears, but clearer than he had ever seen them. "She's really gone? She's really gone. And she's not coming back." Emma nodded slowly, as if trying to convince herself that it was true. "Samuel," she said quietly, "what I said about marrying you, I meant it, if you'll have me. Knowing what you know now about my past." Samuel reached out and gently touched Emma's cheek, brushing away her tears with his thumb. "Emma, I don't care what happened to you before. I care about who you are now and who you want to become. If you want to marry me, really want to, not just to escape your mother, then I would be honored to be your husband." Emma searched his face for any sign of deception or hidden agenda, but found only sincerity and kindness. Slowly, a smile began to spread across her features, the first genuine smile Samuel had seen from her since finding her in his barn. "Then yes," she said softly, "I want to marry you, Samuel Hartwell." Samuel felt his own smile answer hers as he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Then let's go to Copper Creek and find us a preacher." As they rode toward town together, Samuel reflected on the strange turns that life could take. 3 days ago, he had been a solitary rancher, content with his quiet existence and expecting nothing more from life than the satisfaction of honest work and the freedom of the frontier. Now he was riding toward his wedding, beside a woman who had appeared in his barn like an answer to a prayer he had never known he was praying. Emma's past might be complicated, her mother might be a monster, and their future might be uncertain. But as Samuel looked at Emma, at the way the afternoon sun caught the gold in her hair, at the growing confidence in her posture, at the hope that was beginning to replace the fear in her green eyes, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And that, Samuel thought, was worth more than all the quiet, safe solitude in the world. The ride to Copper Creek would take them 3 hours, and by the time they returned to the ranch, they would be husband and wife. Samuel had no idea that their marriage would become the foundation for a love story that would be told for generations, or that Emma would prove to be not just a survivor, but a partner whose strength and intelligence would help them build an empire together. All he knew was that he had found something precious in his barn, something worth protecting and cherishing for the rest of his life, and sometimes that was enough to change everything.